The names in this story have been changed for privacy. This is my confession, told from my side of things. Judge me if you want, but I just want to be honest about what really happened. I'm Emily, 32 years old. Until recently, I thought I had it all figured out. A husband, a home, and a beautiful 4-year-old daughter, Sophie. But behind the perfectly curated Instagram photos, the smiles at school events, and the weekend family outings, I was suffocating. I was trapped in a life that looked beautiful to everyone else, but felt like a cage to me. It all started with feeling invisible. My husband, Jason, loved me in his own way. Steady, responsible, dependable. He provided for us, kept our lives organized, and never gave me a reason to question his loyalty. And that was the problem. Loyalty and responsibility had replaced passion, excitement, and connection. Conversations became transactional, our intimacy dwindled, and I found myself craving anything that made me feel alive again. And then there was Liam. Liam wasn't Jason. He was younger, full of energy, and reminded me of who I used to be: spontaneous, desired, exciting. Our connection was electric, dangerous, intoxicating. I never intended for it to go beyond small flirty messages at first, but feelings don't follow rules, and desire doesn't ask for permission. I remember the first night it escalated. Jason had gone out of town for work, leaving me alone with Sophie. I told myself I'd just meet Liam for dinner, just a harmless distraction. But as soon as I saw him, something inside me clicked. Years of boredom, frustration, and suppressed longing erupted in an instant. We laughed, we talked, and before I realized it, boundaries were gone. The line I told myself I'd never cross? I had crossed it. For months, I balanced my two lives. I played the perfect wife and mother at home, smiled at Jason's jokes, made Sophie pancakes on Saturday mornings, all while sneaking texts, calls, and secret meetings with Liam. The thrill of it was addictive. Every lie I told felt like fuel, every secret rendezvous like a small victory. But secrets have a way of unraveling. It started subtly. Jason grew suspicious, a lingering glance at my phone, questions about my whereabouts, little comments that hinted he knew something was off. I dismissed it, laughed it off, and doubled down on my charade. After all, I was careful. No one could know. Not Jason, not Sophie, not anyone. Then came the divorce talk. I remember it vividly. Jason walked through the door that Tuesday evening, tired from work, expecting a normal night. He didn't know the storm was coming. I had rehearsed my lines countless times in my head, had planned the words like a script for a play. But no rehearsal could calm the pounding in my chest when I finally spoke. I want a divorce. For words. Cold. Unapologetic. Truthful in the most brutal way possible. He froze. I could see it in his eyes. Confusion, hurt, disbelief. But I didn't waver. I had already made up my mind. Jason had built a life of stability, yes, but it wasn't mine anymore. I wanted freedom, control, and a life that made me feel alive. And if that meant breaking my family apart, so be it. I outlined my terms like a general planning a battle: the house, the car, custody arrangements, and child support. I knew I was hitting him hard, but I didn't care. I justified it in my mind. Jason had everything he needed, everything I'd allowed him to have. Now it was my turn. The first few weeks were the hardest. I watched as his face fell every time we discussed logistics, every time he realized the reality of what was happening. And yet, in some twisted way, I felt powerful. I was in control for the first time in years. But control is a dangerous illusion. Even as I signed the papers and met with lawyers, a part of me feared the consequences.
What if Sophie hated me?
What if Jason found out about Liam? What if the world saw me for what I truly was, a selfish, deceitful woman? The fear was real, but it was buried under layers of determination. I couldn't afford hesitation. Then came the worst part. Jason struggled with child support. I expected resistance, but the level of his desperation surprised me. He'd moved out, found a tiny apartment, and tried to balance work and custody. But the demands I placed, the legal payments, the control, it began to break him. And I couldn't deny that a small part of me felt satisfaction. But my satisfaction was short-lived. Secrets have a way of coming back, and truth has a way of finding its way into the light. Liam had been patient, but he grew restless. I grew anxious. And somewhere in the chaos, I made a mistake that would change everything: Sophie's paternity. It wasn't supposed to be revealed. Not yet. Not ever. But a mutual friend, someone who had seen pieces of my double life, dropped hints, nudging Jason toward a truth I had fought so hard to hide. When he discovered the letters, the whispers, the discrepancies, everything unraveled. I watched from a distance as the man I once loved, the man who had been my rock, was dragged through a nightmare of my own making. And then, the final blow, the DNA test. Sophie wasn't Jason's. The words hit me harder than any slap, any scream, any confrontation could have. The child I had raised, loved, and nurtured, the child who called me Mom every morning and clung to me at night, wasn't his. And I had been the architect of this deception. As I held the papers, staring at the numbers and the truth staring back at me, I realized the gravity of what I had done. Liam, Jason, Sophie, all caught in a web I had spun. And there was no going back. First update. I thought I was ready for the fallout. I thought I could handle the storm I had unleashed. I thought I had carefully mapped out every step: divorce, child support, control, and yet nothing could have prepared me for the reality that hit once Jason discovered the truth. The day he got the DNA test results, I watched from across the room, pretending to sort laundry, pretending not to care, but inside I was unraveling. His face went pale as he read the paper. The shock, the confusion, the hurt, it was all there, raw and unfiltered. He looked at me like I had been a stranger living in his house for years. And maybe, in a way, I had been. "Emily, what is this?" he asked, his voice trembling, a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. I swallowed hard. I wanted to lie, to manipulate, to spin a story that would save me.
But there was no spinning this.
The truth had teeth, and it sank deep. "It's Sophie's test," I said softly, keeping my tone measured. It proves she isn't yours." I should have seen the devastation in his eyes, the way the color drained from his face, the way his hands trembled. But instead of regret, I felt something else. A thrill, a strange mix of fear and satisfaction. He went silent for a long time. I could see him processing everything: the years of child support, the custody battles, the weekends he had fought so hard to keep. Every moment I had manipulated, every step I had planned to control him, now collided with this single revelation: the child he thought was his own wasn't. Jason left the room without a word. I didn't follow him. I knew better. I let him retreat into his anger, his pain, and his disbelief. I had learned over the months that chasing him or trying to explain would only make him stronger, and I wanted control. I wanted him broken, just enough that he would never suspect anything else I was hiding. The next few days were hell. I had anticipated conflict, arguments, and negotiation, but nothing prepared me for the emotional warfare that followed. Jason refused to speak to me directly. Every interaction was through lawyers, letters, or terse messages. And through it all, I kept Sophie close. I played the role of the grieving, remorseful mother perfectly, hiding the excitement I felt at the power I now held. Yet even as I celebrated my victory in private, I started to see cracks. Liam, who had been patient until now, grew anxious. The thrill of secrecy was gone. Every glance, every touch, every moment felt like it carried weight. The reality that Sophie was biologically his child, and not Jason's, began to press down on me. I tried to remind myself why I had done it, why I had lied, manipulated, and stolen these years. I was trapped in a marriage that had dulled my soul, and this was my escape. But escape comes at a price, and the cost was starting to feel heavier than I had imagined. Jason began to fight back legally, leveraging the paternity results, demanding compensation, and threatening to take full custody. For the first time, I felt vulnerable. My carefully constructed plans were no longer enough to shield me. I had to strategize, maneuver, and negotiate like never before. Every interaction with my lawyer became a battle. how to keep control, how to protect Liam's identity, how to make sure Sophie remained with me, even as the truth threatened to destroy everything. And then there was Sophie. I hadn't anticipated the emotional weight of her innocence. She didn't understand why Daddy no longer wanted to see her as often, why her weekends were disrupted, or why her father looked at her with confusion and sorrow instead of love. Every night, as I tucked her into bed, I felt a pang of guilt. But guilt has a way of growing quietly, insidiously. I started noticing small things. The way Sophie would ask about her father, the way she clung to me a little tighter, the way she looked at me with those trusting eyes, and I wondered if I could maintain the lie indefinitely. Could I protect her innocence without cracking under the weight of my own deception? I threw myself into my new life, meticulously crafting a routine that would keep Sophie close, Liam safe, and Jason at bay. Every legal document, every text message, every smile I gave Sophie was calculated. But the human heart doesn't always follow logic. There were moments, fleeting, subtle, almost imperceptible, when I felt fear. The fear of losing control, the fear of being exposed, and the fear that Jason would find a way to unravel everything. The turning point came one evening when Liam and I had an argument. For the first time, the reality of our situation hit me with full force. Sophie was biologically his. Jason had been supporting her for years, and I had built my entire life on a web of lies. The guilt, fear, and adrenaline mixed into a cocktail that left me shaking. Liam didn't care about finesse. He cared about truth, about Sophie, about justice in his eyes. "I can't keep living like this," he said, frustration and anger clear in his voice. "She's my daughter, Emily. Jason isn't the father. You can't just manipulate everyone and expect it to be okay forever." His words echoed in my mind long after he left. I knew he was right, and yet I didn't want to give up the life I had carved out. The thrill, the control, the power, it was intoxicating. But now it felt like a prison. Every decision I had made to protect myself and my freedom now trapped me in anxiety and fear. Meanwhile, Jason's legal strategy became more aggressive. He demanded full transparency, investigated every payment, and began pursuing charges of fraud. I watched in terror as the walls I had built around myself started to crumble. Every step I had planned now required vigilance, precision, and a constant dance of deception. And through it all, Sophie remained the innocent center of my storm. She didn't know the full truth, the deception, the lies, the manipulation. She only knew me as her mother. And I clung to that, promising myself that no matter what, I would protect her, shield her from the truth, and maintain the life I had promised her. But as the days turned into weeks, the constant stress, fear, and paranoia began to take their toll. I realized that while I had fought to gain control over Jason, Liam, and the situation, I had lost control over myself. And I knew, deep down, that the real test was coming, the day when the law, the truth, and reality would collide, forcing me to confront everything I had done and everything I had lost. Second update. The day of the court hearing arrived faster than I expected. Weeks of sleepless nights, whispered phone calls, legal strategies, and quiet panic had led up to this moment. I had practiced my composure in front of the mirror countless times, rehearsing the version of Emily the world was supposed to see. Calm, collected, protective of Sophie, the grieving mother who had done everything for her child. But rehearsals could only do so much. As I walked into the courthouse, I felt the weight of every choice I had made pressing down on me. The polished floors, the echoing halls, the watchful eyes of strangers, it all made my stomach twist. I knew Jason would be there. I didn't know if Liam would show, but I had to assume he would. And I had to assume the truth would finally be on the table. Jason was already there, sitting stiffly in the courtroom, eyes sharp, jaw tight. He looked older, worn out from the battles we'd waged over the last months. I caught his gaze for a moment and looked away quickly. I couldn't let him see the fear beneath my carefully composed exterior. I had to protect myself, protect Sophie, and most importantly, protect Liam. The trial began with formalities that felt almost trivial compared to the storm I felt brewing inside me. When my lawyer finally stood to present our case, I sat quietly, nodding when needed, smiling when necessary. Every glance toward Jason felt like a dagger, but I refused to flinch. Jason's lawyer went first, laying out every detail of the fraud, every payment, every lie, and every moment of manipulation. I could hear the cold efficiency in their words, the way they stripped away the narrative I had built. My stomach churned, but I stayed composed. I reminded myself, I had prepared for this. I had rehearsed the defenses, the justifications, the strategic silences. When my turn came, my lawyer painted the picture I had painstakingly constructed: a mother trying to protect her child, a woman trapped in circumstances beyond her control, a parent doing everything possible to shield Sophie from adult conflicts. I tried to match the calm, measured tone, even as fear threatened to spill over. But the judge was relentless. Every word I said seemed to be questioned, every expression scrutinized. Jason's eyes bore into me with a mixture of pain and accusation that I couldn't escape. I felt the weight of every lie I had told, every secret I had kept, pressing down on me. And for the first time, I realized that power was fragile. Control was temporary. Then came the testimony about the DNA test. Sophie's biological father, Cole, was named. My heart pounded as the courtroom absorbed the truth. Jason's reaction was immediate and visceral. The hurt, the betrayal, the disbelief. He looked as if the world had collapsed around him. And I felt something I didn't expect, a pang of regret. Not for myself, not for Liam, but for Sophie. I saw her small face peeking from behind her babysitter, eyes wide, trying to understand why so many adults were talking, shouting, pointing fingers. I realized that no matter how much I wanted control, I couldn't control the emotional fallout for her. And the thought terrified me. The judge asked questions, and my lawyer defended my actions, emphasizing the complexities, the intentions, and the protective motives. But the truth has a way of piercing every argument. The DNA evidence was undeniable, and the judge made it clear that Emily's actions had consequences beyond legal technicalities. Jason spoke next. His words were measured, but filled with raw emotion. He detailed the years of payments, the weekends he had fought for, the emotional toll of thinking Sophie was his child while carrying the weight of divorce and custody battles. I could hear the sincerity in his voice, the heartbreak, and I realized just how deeply my actions had wounded him. And then the judgment. The courtroom went silent as the judge announced the verdict. Emily's actions constituted fraud. Child support payments had to be recalculated. Legal penalties were imposed. I felt a chill run down my spine. Liam, the quiet observer, now became a critical figure in my life. Every choice I had made had led to this moment, and I could no longer hide behind lies or manipulation. But amidst the chaos, there was a silver lining, fragile as it was. Sophie's welfare became the primary concern. Custody was evaluated with her best interests in mind. I realized that no matter what happened, I had to focus on her. The court couldn't strip me of my role as her mother entirely. I had to rebuild trust, not just with the legal system, but with Jason, with Liam, and most importantly, with Sophie. As we left the courtroom, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. The battle was over, but the war for control, for trust, for the stability of our child's life, had just begun. Every step I took now required careful thought, careful maneuvering, and an awareness that the past could not be erased. That night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, I held her close and whispered promises I intended to keep. Promises of protection, of love, of honesty, even as the shadow of past mistakes loomed large. I realized that control, once so intoxicating, now had to be tempered with responsibility. The stakes were higher than I had ever imagined, and the path forward required courage, clarity, and compassion. I looked at her sleeping face, soft and trusting, and made a vow: no matter what the court decided, no matter what Jason demanded, no matter how high the legal or emotional stakes became, Sophie would remain my priority. I had made mistakes, and I would face the consequences, but I would not let her innocence be collateral damage. The coming months were going to be a trial in themselves, negotiations, legal adjustments, emotional recovery, and the delicate dance of co-parenting with Jason. And I knew one thing for certain. The story was far from over. Final update. The weeks following the courtroom verdict felt like walking through a haze. Every day was a test of patience. Every phone call a potential storm. The court had ruled. Jason's claims were valid. My fraud had consequences, and the custody and support arrangements were being recalculated. I knew I had to face the fallout head-on, but the reality was harsher than I imagined. Sophie's well-being became the central focus. Her world had been shaken, and I could see the confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand why Jason looked so angry, why adults were suddenly talking about money, truth, and lies. She only knew one thing. Life felt different now, uncertain. And I had to be the one to make it feel safe again. I had lost the illusion of control. Every lie, every secret, every calculated move had crumbled. I realized that the power I once held over situations and people was fragile, temporary, and often destructive. I couldn't undo the past, but I could try to rebuild what remained. Jason and I entered negotiations for custody. Every meeting was tense. Every discussion was a reminder of the consequences of my actions. He was still hurt, still angry, and I couldn't blame him. The man I had betrayed, financially and emotionally, now had every reason to distrust me. And yet, there was a shared goal we couldn't ignore. Sophie. The conversations were uncomfortable. Jason insisted on a clear, enforceable schedule, and I agreed because I had no choice. The court monitored every arrangement. Child support was recalculated to reflect the fraud, meaning I had financial obligations I hadn't anticipated. It was a bitter reality, a daily reminder of the mistakes I had made. And then there was Cole, Sophie's biological father. His sudden presence complicated everything further. While he wasn't directly involved in Sophie's day-to-day life, the legal implications of her parentage couldn't be ignored. He had rights, responsibilities, and suddenly became a player in a story I had tried to control for years. I felt an unexpected pang, anger at him for existing in this complicated web, fear for what his presence meant, and a strange, reluctant understanding that Sophie had a right to know him someday. Every day was a balancing act. Sophie's happiness, Jason's mistrust, my own guilt, and the looming presence of Cole created a pressure I hadn't anticipated. I learned quickly that nothing in life was ever simple. Nothing stayed under my control, no matter how carefully I planned. One night, as I watched Sophie sleep, I realized how much I had underestimated the consequences of deception. My lies had not just hurt Jason, they had affected a small, innocent life that depended entirely on the adults around her. And now, I had to face the reality of rebuilding trust, not just legally but emotionally, with everyone involved. Reconciliation wasn't an option yet, and maybe it never would be. Jason's anger was justified, and Cole's existence complicated my life further. But I had to find a way to navigate this new world responsibly. Sophie's welfare couldn't be compromised by my pride, my fears, or my mistakes. Over time, a fragile routine emerged. Jason and I developed a working, if tense, co-parenting arrangement. Weekends, holidays, school events, everything had to be scheduled and carefully monitored. I was careful with every word, every action, knowing that any misstep could jeopardize Sophie's sense of stability. Financially, I had to start over. The court-mandated repayments, the recalculated child support, and the ongoing legal expenses were a constant reminder of my mistakes. I took temporary jobs, worked long hours, and stretched every dollar. I couldn't change the past, but I could try to secure a future where Sophie had everything she needed. Emotionally, I was forced to confront myself. The woman who had once believed she could manipulate outcomes had to accept the consequences of her actions. Humility, accountability, and honesty became the only tools I had left to navigate the wreckage I had created. Then, slowly, life began to find a new rhythm. Sophie's laughter returned in small moments. Jason and I found a grudging respect for each other, built on the shared understanding that we both wanted the same thing, a stable, happy life for Sophie. Even Cole's presence, while awkward, became manageable. The child's welfare was no longer about secrets and deception. It was about truth, structure, and love. I realized finally that justice wasn't about revenge. It was about consequences. I had faced legal penalties, financial consequences, and emotional fallout. And now, in the quiet moments when Sophie hugged me at night, when Jason nodded in agreement during a school pickup, I understood that life, messy as it was, could be rebuilt. I had been forced to grow, forced to see the damage my choices caused, and forced to take responsibility in ways I had never imagined. And through it all, one truth stood out above all. Sophie's happiness and security mattered more than my pride, my fear, or my past. As I tucked Sophie into bed one final time that night, I whispered a promise to her. Not of perfection, not of control, but of presence. I would be there. I would love her. I would protect her. And I would never allow deceit, manipulation, or selfishness to compromise her again. Life wasn't perfect. The consequences of my actions remained. The wounds were deep, and trust had to be rebuilt brick by brick. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a cautious sense of hope. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. And in those lessons, I found the possibility of redemption, accountability, and a future where Sophie could thrive, free from the chaos of my past mistakes. And as I turned off the light and closed her bedroom door, I knew one thing for certain. The story wasn't just about consequences, courtrooms, or betrayal. It was about growth, about facing reality, and about the unshakable bond between a parent and a child, blood or not, that could withstand even the darkest storms.